Thank you. I wonder if I could bring up my presentation.
Most likely.
There we go. Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Academy for this invitation and for a very interesting topic. And I've been asked to talk about botanic gardens and their role globally in conserving the world's rare and threatened plant species, and really to try to answer this question. But I want to just quickly start with a very quick description of BGCI, because from discussions over the last few days, it's clear that we know this, we're not well known outside our own professional community. And it will also explain the context of my talk, which is very much about mobilizing our own. It's a bit like sustainability. Are we doing it at home? And I think challenging our own professional community around plant conservation is the particular role of BGCI. We were established in 1987 by IUCN as a secretariat, and then since then have become an independent NGO. 600 member gardens in over 100 countries. Many more botanic gardens regard themselves as BGCI members, but that doesn't mean that they pay the subscription each year. So we are a broad church. We have offices in Europe, the US, China, Southeast Asia, and Africa, with plans for Central America and the Caribbean and then Latin America. And critically here, there are 60,000 professionals in our network, plant scientists, horticulturists, educators, and so on. So, a big community there that could be mobilized. 500 million visitors visit botanic gardens each year. And that is a whole separate talk on how we engage with those. And we run the BGCI Global Botanic Garden Congresses on public engagement and then also on conservation and horticulture. We've also recently introduced a botanic garden accreditation scheme because, like the zoo community in the European Union and elsewhere, the definition of a botanic garden is inadequate. So preserving the key components of what constitutes a botanic garden is part of our role. And as part of that process, we produced these technical reviews over the last few years. The first was defining the botanic garden and how to measure success, and then updating the definition to bring in sustainability, to bring in adherence to the conventions and so on. And doing the technical review, it was quite clear that most gardens measure success by activity rather than impact. So we commissioned this follow-up report with 28 case studies from around the world of gardens that are measuring impact and how you do that. So on to the main topic of discussion. This is the context. You've heard from John already. 1 in 5 of the world's plant species threatened with extinction. It's largely land use change which is driving that. We've transformed more than 50% of the ice-free terrestrial landscape, mainly for agriculture and pastoralism, and this estimate suggests that over 80% is directly influenced by human activities. The picture on the left there is from the Mafinga Mountains in Zambia, which is about as remote as you can get in Africa. It's 3 days, 2 days drive and 1 day's walk from the capital Lusaka, and this is the watershed for the Luangwa River, which feeds into the Zambezi. And although the vegetation looks pretty undisturbed up there, there are no animals. Because of the people around the base of the mountain, they've all been hunted out. And that, of course, has an impact on the vegetation up there with no seed dispersers, pollinators affected, and so on. So the key thing here is that transformed landscapes are the norm, and these will only increase as human populations increase. And it is in that context that I frame this talk and the role of botanic gardens in how we manage biodiversity in transformed landscapes. Because all of those plants that used to live in that 50% of the transformed landscape are now in trouble. And we have to find room for them if we wish to continue to coexist with them. And of course, one of the challenges for us in Botanic Garden with our visitors is to explain why we should care about 80,000 plant species becoming extinct. And we can make these cases on the basis of the big environmental challenges, food security, water scarcity, energy, we've heard from Peter already, human health, biodiversity conservation. If you want to conserve the tiger or the panda, you need, or your orangutan, you need the vegetation. And then both adaptation and mitigation of climate change. Plants are clearly essential for solutions. Food does not come from the refrigerator, and we need to make those arguments. And we can go further. We can say that, if we lose a plant species here and there, we're not all going to die. But if we switch that around, we can say for every species that we save, we create opportunities for human innovation, adaptation, and resilience. So it's a much more positive message, but still framed within human needs. And we would say in botanic gardens that technically there is no reason why any plant species should become extinct. It is a little bit more complex than that, and we'll hear from Antti and others some of the challenges. But with the array of techniques that we have, from seed banking to horticulture to tissue culture, all the range of techniques used in horticulture, if we can get to them in time, we have a good chance of saving most plant species. So how are we going to do that? And how can we organize ourselves in a way that, as John says, is as efficient as possible? Just like Waza, we have a map. There are 3,000 odd botanic gardens in the world. We maintain a registry of those called Garden Search, more on that in a moment. And we have around 3,500 institutions registered on that. But we estimate around 3,000 of those are what we would understand as a botanic garden, with conservation, science, and education as central to their mandate. Now, how we organize ourselves is an interesting challenge, and I've had the privilege to work for the Global Crop Diversity Trust and with the team, this is the Svalbard Seed Bank up in the Arctic Circle, for about the last decade. And of course, the crop community, with the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of land races and cultivars out there, have what they call a global system. That global system is managed by FAO just down the road here in Rome and is based on these components. There's a global plan of action for plant genetic resources in food and agriculture. There's a review process, which is a periodical state of the world's plant genetic resources in food and agriculture. Critically, there is a network of international institutions and ex situ collections that work with farmers as the in situ component. And then they have a whole range of data interfaces, including Genesis, this portal to the cultivars and land races held in the big seed banks around the world. And then they're working on a universal gene bank information management system, and then even down to characterization data at the genetic level through DivSeq. Now, if you look at us in botanic gardens and looking at rare and threatened wild species, we have a similar potential architecture. We have the global strategy for plant conservation, which Peter, BGCI, many people were responsible for putting together 20 years ago. Now in its second phase, BGCI is the secretariat under the CBD for managing and reporting on that through the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation, which is about 50 plant conservation organizations. And our last meeting was in Cape Town in September last year, reviewing progress against this. We also have a network of international institutions and ex situ collections, you've heard from John, of the North American component of that. And we have a global portal to accession level data in plant search, which needs more work. I'll explain about that. What we don't have is any universal accessions information management system. Those are different in different gardens. We don't yet have advanced bioinformatic tools. So looking a little bit more closely about what we do have within the network, we have impressive infrastructures. We have the most sophisticated seed banks in the world, far better than anything in the crop community because of the complexity of dealing with wild species. We have tissue culture facilities, microprop. We have a huge number of gardens in different habitats with living collections and so on. So the infrastructures, we're in pretty good shape. There's a lot more to do, as I will explain. But there's a lot going for us. We also have technical expertise and plugging into networks like CPC, the Center for Plant Conservation, and taking their guidelines and then sharing those with other networks around the world makes sense, and that's what has been happening for many years. In fact, the Australian Network for Plant Conservation at the bottom has used CPC guidelines for many years and then modified them for their own use. So there's a lot of sharing within our community, and I would like to emphasize that I think botanists on the whole are gentle souls, and we do have a lot of sharing within our community. There isn't a lot of competition, which is something in our favor. When we look at collections, this was a survey we did in 2017 using Plant Search, which is a sample of only about 40% of the world's botanic gardens. But actually the results are quite striking, particularly at the higher taxonomic levels. So 93% of vascular plant families are grown in the world's botanic gardens. There are only 21 families that are not represented. 57% of vascular plant genera, 30% of vascular plant species. This was against the plant list, which at that point was about 352,000 species. And 42% on average, much higher in some places. The European Union, it's about 75% of threatened species are held in global ex situ collections. So what that analysis shows is that we conserve some floras better than others. So 60% of temperate species are conserved in botanic gardens. However, only 25% of tropical species. And of course, it's in the tropics where the vast majority of plant diversity is. So in number terms, this is where the major challenge is. And the reasons for that are lack of capacity. 82% of botanic gardens are located in the northern hemisphere. So this species, Hydrostachys polymorpha, which is a monotypic family, it's a species I know well from South Central Africa, grows in fast-flowing streams. This is one of the families that is not in botanic gardens. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be, except that there are no botanic gardens in the vicinity. We know how to grow plants in fast-growing water. But there is a real disconnect and disjunct in capacity north to south. We also don't conserve non-vascular plants very well at all. And these are ecologically extremely important, but unfortunately they're not very charismatic. We don't have enough experts working on them. So this is obviously a key area where we need to concentrate. So how do we take all of that, our infrastructures, our collections, and start to prioritize efforts? Well, BGCI maintains a number of databases that help us in these efforts. The first of these is Threat Search. Now, unlike IUCN Global Red List database, which only lists those plants, about 7% of the world's plants that have been assessed against IUCN methodology and IUCN Global methodology, Threat Search includes all threatened plant species that have been assessed. So using the NatureServe system in the US, Semonet in Mexico. The Australians use a different variation on the IUCN methodology, etc. They are all there. This is curated. Any new assessment goes on to this. So if you want to find out if your plant is threatened, stick the name into Threat Search, and it will tell you whether that's been assessed as threatened nationally, regionally, or globally. And that gives us a list of threatened species. We can then compare that with Plant Search, which is our list of species grown and held in botanic gardens and seed banks, and we can see whether those threatened species are already in collections, and therefore whether there is expertise in those gardens related to those collections or perhaps closely related collections. We then have Garden Search, which starts to tell us who is where. So as I say, there's about 3,500 botanical institutions on this registry. If we know where the plant is, we know it's threatened, we know it's not in collections, we can use Garden Search to contact the people in that country to say, are you working on this? And is this a priority for you? If it isn't, and if there's technical support needed, then we can start to coordinate efforts around specific interventions and specific methodologies. This is our Global Seed Conservation Challenge, about 200 participating botanic gardens with native plant seed banks. There are about 400 gardens with seed banks in our network overall. But this supports botanic gardens to do more seed conservation, challenges them, and provides training. For exceptional species, or recalcitrant species if you prefer, that are difficult to store in conventional seed banks, and we'll hear from Chris later on those, we've now started to establish consortia to build genetically comprehensive living collections and critically here to ensure the conservation of these species in situ. So this is integrated in situ, ex situ conservation. And we recognize, of course, that putting back single species is not going to do the trick. We need to get a lot better at more complex restoration. So we also manage the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens. This has its own microsite with methodologies and case studies, 40 participating institutions managing about 200 projects worldwide, from very small scale to very large scale. The value of those projects is about $150 million. And the example there is from Hong Kong. This is in the hills behind Kowloon, and this is Kadori Farm and Botanical Garden, who for the last decade have been managing and restoring subtropical forest for species diversity specifically. So there are about 300 tree species in 50 hectares, with every variable being measured, from weed control to fire to everything. You know, a fantastic project, I think, which will take us forward with some of these big issues. So just looking a little bit more closely, and if we take trees, where we have a very strong program, we also manage the Global Trees Campaign, and this is going for the critically endangered tree species. So this is the most threatened tree species in the world. There are 60,000 tree species. Of those, only about half have been assessed for their conservation status. Of the 30,000 that have been assessed, 9,600 are threatened at some level. Of those, 1,900 are critically endangered. Of those, 503 are critically endangered against the D criterion. So there are fewer than 50 individuals left in the wild. Those are the ones that we go for as a priority. And when you're dealing with 503 species and you have 3,000 botanic gardens, this starts to be manageable. Of course, there are many other threatened plant species, but this is specifically around trees. And the way this works would be working with our partners in country. So I was recently in Mauritius, which is, like Hawaii, is a global hotspot for threatened species, 54 critically endangered tree species against the D criterion. Hyophobia maricolis on the left there with the cage around it is arguably the world's rarest tree. There's one left. It's never been propagated. It's 150 years old. It's in Kura Botanic Garden. Somebody needs to propagate it. So we will be in touch with Patrick at Montgomery Botanical Center to see if he can help and get him out there. Brest Conservatoire already working on this as well. But we have examples of where this has worked. Café Marron from Rodrigues nearby was down to a single plant species, a single plant rather, 31 years ago. It's now been reintroduced. It's in third generation producing seed through the efforts of botanic gardens. And there are thousands of examples around the world of this working. And of course, one way that we can ensure this happens is through knowledge exchange. So we deploy experts from different parts of the world to lead training courses in all of these disciplines. I was talking to John yesterday, and John made a really great analogy, I think, with Médecins Sans Frontières, where we are asking institutions to give us their experts free of charge. We can cover the travel, we can cover the cost of them staying in hotels or research centers. But if we can get those people free of charge and their time, that is the major cost, and that way we can address some of these challenges. And that's exactly what is happening already at a smaller scale. And of course, funding is always the big constraint for us. So we send out funding, and we're establishing Global Botanic Garden Fund this year, which will give out small grants, but this is a drop in the ocean compared to what is required. And there's a bigger challenge. The bigger challenge is cultural. It's not technical, and it's not financial. And I think this is really where we need to work together as a community. We can do all of these things. We can find plants, we can identify them, we can conserve them in seed banks, tissue cultures, and increasingly in situ. We can grow and manage diverse species assemblages. It's what we do in botanic gardens, and particularly in transformed landscapes. And increasingly, we are learning to restore habitats and reintroduce more complex species assemblages. But we need to put much more into it. And we've established a global leadership forum. This is our International Advisory Council, who meet every year. This was in Cape Town in September. There's 30 directors on this from 6 continents. And we're starting to get that group to think at the policy level, and particularly to persuade our own through their own networks to make this a priority. And I think perhaps the most powerful argument is, who else do we expect to do this? We're the only professional community able to apply our knowledge in this way. This picture, by the way, taken from the Man of the Year competition a few years ago. Really the responsibility falls on us because we have that capability. And I'll just end now with the garden, because the IPBES report reminded me of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was published in 2005, making many of the same arguments at the ecosystem level. And if we're to be environmentally proactive, then that means gardening. The techno-garden or the adapting mosaic for those transformed landscapes. And gardens have long been used as a metaphor for the way that we interact with the environment. So I'm going to take you back even further than Noah to the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is where we came from, but I would argue it's also where we need to get to. Because unless we can learn to live in harmony with the other organisms that we share this planet with and have an equal right to be here, then I think that we are all doomed, I'm afraid. Thank you.